Thanks everybody for coming tonight. We're going to talk about the Trump-Biden peace plan, the legislative package to help us end poverty, end mass incarceration, and end the endless wars in 2024. I have not actually done an official count of like how many different policies there are wrapped up in this, but the legislative package is drafted and we'll be going out to the members to vote for ratification this with May's Fast for Peace. Then we'll start opening up for feedback and people whose areas of expertise cover all of these different topics can help clarify and improve the package so we can make a really good offer to the American people in 2024. So as you know, the American Union's based on the 5 duties in the preamble of the Constitution. And so the Trump-Biden peace plan, the legislative package, is laid out the same way, 5 titles and 5 different sections. And I'm going to kind of go through all these relatively quickly. And if people have questions, we can take questions at the end and come back to it. So our first duty is to establish justice. You heard me say we're failing when 2 million Americans wake up behind bars every single day. So we're going to reform the criminal justice system. And there's 3 major parts. There's the police reform, prosecutorial reform, and prison reform for all aspects of our prison industrial complex. And this is a federal package of legislation, so you're sort of limited in what you can do to persuade the states to go along with some of these reforms. We can do an awful lot at the top, lead by example, but one of the pieces of leverage that the federal government does have over the states is the grants that they make for law enforcement. And so we can threaten to withhold those if states don't adopt similar policy. So we got a mandatory training course in de-escalation for law enforcement officers, prohibiting them from using deadly force except as a last resort. You might know that law enforcement officers kill 1,000 people a year in the United States, and that's a number of needless deaths that we can definitely bring down. There'll be a public searchable National Police Misconduct Registry. If there are bad apples, they don't pop up in another police department somewhere else. And also, again, de-escalation, we would add chokeholds and corroded holds that cut off the air or blood to someone's brain, make those a civil rights violation. One of the other ways we can help reform the police is by abolishing qualified immunity. Currently, gives them immunity from civil rights violations in many cases. This is not something that Congress has done. This is strictly something that the Supreme Court invented. Congress can clean this up. No-knock warrants, 4 years now since Breonna Taylor was killed in the middle of the night, police bursting through her door. Strict no-knock warrants. And then for the states, also incentivize them to stop using them in drug cases. And there are police officers as well as homeowners get hurt in these no-knock warrants. When somebody comes bursting through the door, the normal reaction not to stop and say, who is it? Police officers get shot when they do these. And so the answer isn't more force. The answer is de-escalation. And one of the things that encourages these kinds of behaviors is the 1033 program, which puts military surplus in the hands of local police departments. So we'd repeal that program as well. As far as prosecutorial reforms, the biggest change we're going to make is ending the federal war on drugs. You heard me talk earlier or another time about the 9-step plan for ending the federal war on drugs and creating a framework for legalization, regulation, and taxation that the 50 states can opt into. That framework would include a 12% sales tax, and which would be used to fund treatment services for anyone who wants it. But it would let the states continue to set their own policies the way that we did after ending alcohol prohibition back in the 1930s. In that case, Kansas stayed a dry state until after World War II. States set their own policies and we can end the drug war the same way. The other prosecutorial reforms are some of these like cash bail, where cash bail is used to incentivize people to agree to a self-service conviction, to take a plea deal just out of jail because they can't afford to leave. So we end that on the federal level, incentivize states to minimize the practice, get rid of civil asset forfeiture, taking people's stuff even when they haven't been convicted of anything, removing mandatory minimums from the United States Code, reforming the Espionage Act of 1917, often used to go after whistleblowers like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, Reality Winner, and others. And so by reforming it to require a specific intent to cause harm, we protect these whistleblowers and journalists. Clarify that the Real ID Act is not a national ID card system, that ID requirements only apply to those required to show ID already. One of the biggest changes to our legal system would be a new tax on lawyers, which a fee and dividend model would take those tax dollars, and distribute them back to people who are arrested, use them to pay for legal service. So give access to legal knowledge to everyone up front and create a new business model for lawyers who actually want to be stewards of justice and actually instead of just trying to work for the highest bidder. That would great deal to help change the way that the justice system works. Prison reforms, solitary confinement would be restricted to 15 days, which is what the United Nations says should be a cap. So that's the place to start, is with United Nations recommendations. Some states have already phased out solitary confinement and had good results. So by changing our policy on the national level, we'll continue to incentivize that. Sentence reviews after 10 years, reducing our prison population towards ending mass incarceration by giving people an opportunity to have their sentences reviewed. Would require finding that the person wasn't a danger to others, that they were ready for reentry, and that it was in the interest. A couple of Supreme Court decisions in the last few years that have restricted the ability of incarcerated people to have their convictions reviewed, make those technical corrections, help people leaving prison, make sure they have identification documents, phasing out the use of for-profit prisons by the federal government. It's a small percentage of the total. It's only about 7% of prisoners are in for-profit prisons, but there's a fundamental conflict when it comes to keeping people in cages and the for-profit industry. Right? Nobody should profit from that. So to the extent it has to be done, let the government do. Also improve access to the prison litigation by repealing the prison litigation reform, improve access to the judicial system for the incarcerated, fully restore their access to Pell Grants. So that's an awful lot of criminal justice reform. These are not the only issues, but they are a lot more than any Congress has accomplished in a long time. And we do a lot to really reshape and rethink the way that our justice system works. Ensuring domestic tranquility. In 2022, Roe versus Wade had not been struck down, and so the truce on guns and abortion was a little simpler. But since that time, the Trump-Biden peace plan essentially returns us to the Roe decision, and so it protects access to abortion through viability. States can set restrictions after that. It would repeal the 19th century Comstock Act that can be used to limit pharmaceutical abortions by mail. And we'll talk to in a minute when we get to the American Union Jobs Program, the unconditional basic income. Pregnant women would be able to start collecting a UBI payment for their children before they're born. As you may have heard me point out, that 2/3 of women who seek abortion say they can't afford the baby, and so that's a problem that we can fix. And so by addressing that problem, we're going to go after the root causes of gun deaths and abortion, drive those down, and reduce the number of needless deaths. When it comes to guns, got universal background checks in the package. The other component is the Hyde Amendment, which prohibits using federal funds for abortion, would also be codified. Currently, it's tacked into a piece of legislation each year. Under these scenarios, everybody gets something. Everybody compromises. Overall, these provisions are all popular. These are common sense, middle ground kind of positions. So these are the calmer heads that we want to prevail here. And this truce would last for 10 years. Put a legislative ban on making any changes to this for 10 years. And so after 10 years, we can reevaluate, see how things are working then. It's not good for America to keep constantly fighting over these wedge issues. Let's make some progress on the root causes and then put them aside for 10 years. Third duty is providing for the common defense, and the Trump-Biden peace plan would reduce the military-industrial complex. That means repealing some of the authorizations for war, authorizations for military force that are kind of used as blank checks in the Middle East, reducing the military budget by a third, 4 years, reducing our number of military bases by holding local referendums world and asking the populations if they want us there. And if they don't, expecting their decision within another year and closing those. Have the Secretary of State construct a plan for formally ending the Korean War. Probably know it's been more than 70 years since an armistice was signed, and that's it. So after all these generations, time to finally bring this to a conclusion. When it comes to nuclear weapons, a couple things. Adopting a unconditional no first strike policy for nuclear weapons. Again, trying to restore America's moral standing on the world stage by saying, look, we're not going to use these first. In addition, we scaled back the nuclear stockpile by 50% over the next 5 years, as well as scale back planned upgrades to intercontinental ballistic missiles in the Midwest. Those other weapons that we'd be phasing out would be landmines. Right now, Donald Trump and Joe Biden have kind of gone back and forth on landmine policy for the United States. So we would codify the current policy, establish a 5-year timetable to cease using them. Currently, presidents have claimed an exemption for the Korean Peninsula. Another big cause of harm that we around the world is the use of economic sanctions, where we target civilian populations, and they're harmed by these sanctions that we have on more than 30 countries. So we'd restrict that. Few exceptions during military hostilities or part of a broad coalition. Last but not least, in trying to improve our moral standing, would be closing Guantanamo Bay military prison. Decades of incarcerating men there without charging them with anything, it's really a stain on the United States' reputation. So we closed that down within the year. Any detainees who are being charged or under trial, or any men who've been convicted, can be transferred to Fort Leavenworth camp. And lethal autonomous weapons, I guess, was the other item there. Again, leading by example, we're not going to develop these weapons that can take a human life without human intervention. Promoting the general welfare, our fourth duty, is unconditional basic income, $1,400 a month for adults, a third of that for kids. To start every American family up above the poverty line. These would be issued through Treasury dollar bills, a sovereign currency issued by the U.S. Treasury, and by establishing digital accounts and a public payment infrastructure. We'd offer a free public option to the banking system and the for-profit system that really takes a toll on people's finances. Be overseen by the Social Security Administration, generally very efficient, and some of the other ways of addressing poverty. People on Social Security, disability income, social supplementary income, I forget exactly what it stands for. They have very low thresholds. They're not allowed to have more than $2,000 or $3,000 in assets, depending on whether they're single or married. And so we increase, and it's a number that hasn't been increased in decades, and so they're trapped in poverty, and Congress has failed to update it. So we're going to update that and increase it to the UBI amount, and is indexed to inflation, so it would increase in future years. And the new public payment infrastructure would work with the existing financial one, so that to keep your bank account, you can just have it be your UBI direct deposited in your bank account if you want. If you don't want to do that, it can be applied as a tax credit. Some of the offsets for unconditional basic income, the three main ones are a value-added tax, 12% value-added tax, consumption tax, that will make sure that those who spend the most are paying the most, able to hide their income to avoid paying this. The healthcare reform, establish 18 weeks of paid family leave, again, helping bring down America's infant mortality rate, preventing needless death. Public option for health insurance based on Biden's campaign promises, increasing the supply of doctors, making it easier for students to borrow money, get Stafford loans for medical education, and promoting a 6-year pipeline through medical school, and also lowering drug prices by restricting the practices of pharmaceutical benefit managers and requiring negotiation for the price of prescription drugs. Common sense things that Congress has no incentive to actually fix. So that's why we changed the model, so they'll have no choice except to go along. Last but not least is securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So we've got some new things in here from the 2022 package. Still universal suffrage, establishing voting privileges in all federal elections, protecting Social Security instead of the current cap where people stop paying into Social Security at $168,600 a year, increase that to $420,000. Some of the biggest obstacles to getting things done in Washington are the threats of government shutdowns or the showdowns over the debt ceiling. We just take those off the table. Abolishing the debt ceiling, establishing automatic continuing resolutions if Congress fails to pass a budget. There would also be some restrictions on Congress, things that they could do or couldn't do until they pass the budget. Stop letting Congress distract us and instead make it easier to get things done. There are some immigration provisions in here. The system needs a big overhaul, but so we've got the DREAM Act. Immigrants who are brought here illegally as children would have a path to citizenship. There's a requirement for large employers to participate in an E-Verify program to verify that workers are eligible to work in the United States. That's phased in over the first 2 years, or over 2 years, and it will go to companies with over 100 employees would be required to use the system. There's also about $10 billion for additional border security and for improving immigration courts, smooth out some of those systems. Then the last two are the pollution fees on carbon, and an increase in carbon fees so that the people who pollute the most pay the most, and then a plastic fee discouraging the production of new plastic and the use of single use. So by combining all of these things together, we've got a huge legislative package that will accomplish many, many reforms that Congress has failed to enact. Many of these provisions in the legislative package are taken directly from proposed pieces of legislation that have stalled in Congress. Those police reforms came from the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2020 that the House passed a couple times and the Senate never did anything with.